Every flood season, an entire town moves its furniture up one flight of stairs and waits. Sometimes for a week, sometimes for a month. Inside houses standing on a mechanism European engineers wouldn't formalize for centuries. A port that died so slowly, nobody marked the year. A town that got poor enough to accidentally save itself. This is Hoi An, the town that survives by letting itself drown. First, the color. Ochre walls gone soft at the edges. The paint eaten down to plaster by 100 wet seasons. Patched, eaten again. Moss climbs the base of every wall on the shaded side of the street and stops exactly where the sun reaches by noon. Wooden shutters, swollen shut by humidity more often than by choice. Before the shop fronts open, before the lanterns are lit, this is what the street actually looks like. A town built to be retouched forever, never finished. This is Hoi An, on Vietnam's central coast, where the Tu Bon River meets the sea. For 400 years, it was one of Southeast Asia's busiest trading ports. Chinese, Japanese, Dutch, and Portuguese ships anchored here to trade silk, ceramics, and spices, long before the country that now contains it had settled its modern borders. Some of its merchant houses have stood since before the Ming dynasty gave way to the Qing. Furniture, roof beams, and family altars passed down as a single continuous inheritance, one generation simply moving out of the way for the next. Every house here is built from ironwood and jackfruit timber, joined without a single nail, held together by carved interlocking beams that a carpenter could disassemble by hand, and one warped joint, left unrepaired, could bring an entire roof down onto the family beneath it. They built anyway. Because the reason the town looks unfinished is the same reason it is still standing at all. It has never stopped absorbing damage and repairing itself in the same motion. A town that heals faster than it breaks. Spring arrives first, and it arrives quietly. By February, the bougainvillea along the canal walls has gone from bare branches to a wall of pink in under 3 weeks. Morning fog sits low over the river until 9, then burns off into a light so soft that photographers plan entire trips around this 1 month. But spring in Hoi An is also flood recovery season. The town spends these weeks scrubbing silt out of ground floor shops that drowned the previous autumn. Every beautiful street here is also a maintenance schedule. The blossoms and the bleach buckets arrive together. 3 kilometers downriver, the fishing boats that spent the winter under tarpaulins get repainted the same shade of blue they've used for generations. So a boat lost at sea can be identified from the color alone. Then comes the heat. By May, the temperature inside the tiled roofs of the old shophouses can climb past what the human body finds tolerable indoors. And the wooden shutters that keep out storms in autumn are the same shutters trapping that heat in summer. The architecture that saves the town twice a year punishes it the other 10 months. Yet some places make even that heat look mild. The lantern workshops on the edge of town run bamboo steaming vats at close range for hours at a time, all summer, so the town has enough silk lanterns ready before the season Hoi An is actually famous for arrives. Because the festival everyone photographs takes 11 months of preparation to produce 1 cue of light. By June, the river is at its lowest point of the year. Boats scrape bottom in places tourists don't see, and the same water that will submerge the streets in October is, right now, barely deep enough to float a canoe. A river that starves in summer to drown in autumn. Here's what almost nobody explains about why these houses are still standing. The merchant houses of Hoi An were never built with their timber posts sunk into the ground. Each pillar rests on a stone plinth, raised above the earth, so the wood never sits in standing moisture long enough to wick it upward through the grain. A process engineers call capillary rise, the same slow upward creep of water through porous material that ruins modern basements when it isn't accounted for. Builders here solved it by accident, centuries before the term existed. It's the identical principle behind the damp-proof coursing required in modern foundations worldwide. A layer that breaks water's upward path before it reaches structural wood. Which is why houses with stone plinths have outlasted the ones without them by centuries, not decades. But knowledge like this only matters if someone keeps repairing the joints on schedule. In the wet season, nobody does that voluntarily. Once a month, on the 14th night of the lunar calendar, Hoi An turns its electricity off. Streetlights go dark. Shop fronts switch to candlelight. The only illumination left comes from paper lanterns, hundreds of them, strung overhead and set floating down the river in small paper boats, each one carrying a wish someone paid a child on the riverbank a few thousand dong to release. The river fills with drifting orange light, and for one night the town looks exactly like the postcards. Except the postcards are lying by omission. This isn't a permanent state. It's a scheduled exception, switched back off by morning. Locals call it the Lantern Full Moon Festival. Visitors call it magic. Both descriptions are correct, and neither survives past sunrise. But the artisans who hand-fold each lantern are getting older, and fewer of their children are staying to learn the trade. For the women who row the lantern boats after dark, this is not a performance. It's a 9-hour shift on the water, paddling the same 40-meter stretch of river hundreds of times a night, for a wage measured in thousands of individual tourist transactions rather than a fixed rate. Their office is the river. Their overhead is a wooden oar and a straw hat. Silk weaving pays even less predictably. A single hand-loomed silk scarf can take a skilled weaver most of a working day to finish, competing directly against machine-made imitations sold 2 streets over for a fraction of the price. Tourists photograph the loom. Almost none of them buy what it produces. Across the canal, the tailors work differently. Same-day custom clothing has become the town's second economy, built on shops that promise a finished suit or dress within 24 hours. It works because someone is sewing through the night to make the deadline true. Outsiders call it impressively fast service. The people cutting fabric at 2 a.m. call it Tuesday. Tourists pay for the fantasy of a town frozen in the past. The people who make that fantasy function are running one of the most demanding small-scale manufacturing operations on the coast, invisibly, behind shop fronts styled to look centuries old. Then autumn brings the flood, and every one of these trades stops at once. Shops seal their doors with sandbags and plastic sheeting they've reused for years. Furniture goes up to the second floor on ropes. Some families simply move upstairs and live there for as long as the water holds the ground floor. Sometimes a single week, sometimes closer to a month. For those families, flood season isn't a metaphor for anything. It's an eviction that happens on a schedule, from their own homes, by their own river. November is when the river stops behaving. Storms that form far out in the South China Sea funnel rain down the central coast with almost nowhere to go. The Thuban rises, not for hours, for days. Streets that carried foot traffic in the morning carry boats by evening. Families paddle grocery deliveries down what used to be a road. The water finds the same painted line on the same walls, year after year, and sometimes it beats that line by more than a meter. Electricity gets cut before the water reaches the sockets, not as a precaution, as a certainty. Every household already knows the order of operations. Unplug, move upstairs, wait. The old town has flooded to damaging depths more than once in a single decade. And in the worst recorded years, the water has climbed high enough to submerge entire ground floors for days at a time. Nobody drowns inside their own home here. That isn't luck. It's 400 years of knowing exactly which shelf is above the line and which one isn't. The river takes the street. It has never once taken the town. It looks like the water is on fire. At night, during the worst of the flooding, the streetlights that remain lit reflect off a surface, moving just fast enough to fracture every reflection into something closer to flame than light. It isn't fire, it's a river, running through a street that was never built to be a riverbed, doing exactly that anyway. These aren't decorations left over from a festival. In the oldest merchant houses, faded pencil marks still run up the interior walls, one line per flood, one date beside each line, kept by families as an unofficial archive going back generations. Nobody photographs it for the postcards. It is, in its own way, the most complete flood record the town owns. Certain houses flood every single year to nearly identical depths, while others 2 doors down, at the same elevation, barely take on water at all. Longtime residents blame old drainage channels buried under later construction. No survey has ever mapped them completely. Even the wells are strange. A handful of centuries-old wells throughout the old town are believed by residents to draw from a different aquifer than the surrounding ground. Cooler, cleaner, and apparently untouched by the river's yearly invasion just meters away. Nobody has ever fully explained why. Locals have their own theories about why some houses flood to the same depth every year, while the ones next door barely take on water. Old drainage nobody mapped? Something about the original foundations? If you've been to Hoi An, or you've got a guess, drop it below. But surviving flood season was never the real threat Hoi An faced. The real threat arrived slower, and it came from the river deciding to leave. By the 18th century, silt had begun quietly filling the mouth of the Thu Bon, the same river that had made Hoi An one of the busiest ports in Southeast Asia for 4 centuries. Ships that once needed deep water to dock started running aground further and further from the merchant houses that depended on them. It took decades, not centuries. A port doesn't collapse in a single storm. It simply becomes less useful, one shallower tide at a time, until the ships stop coming at all. Foreign merchant communities that had lived in Hoi An for generations began relocating to Da Nang, whose harbor stayed deep enough for the newer, larger vessels of the 19th century. Entire trading houses closed within a single lifetime. Warehouses that had processed silk and porcelain for export sat empty, their doors intact, their ledgers unfinished. The port was already dying here. What happened next wasn't a slower decline. It was the accident that saved the whole town, and it's coming up. Subscribe if you want to see how a place gets rich by going broke. And yet people stayed. Not because the port still worked, it didn't, but because the houses were paid for, the ancestors were buried nearby, and leaving a 400-year-old family home for a functioning harbor felt, to the families who remained, like the wrong kind of trade. Their refusal to leave a dying port is the only reason there was still a town left to save when the rest of the world rediscovered it 2 centuries later. For nearly 200 years, almost nobody outside central Vietnam thought about Hoi An at all. The port that once loaded ships bound for Nagasaki and Amsterdam went quiet so gradually that no single year marks its ending. There was no fire, no storm, no single collapse. Trade simply stopped choosing this river, and the town it had built kept standing, with nowhere new to grow, which, by accident, is what preserved it. While Vietnam industrialized, urbanized, and rebuilt around it, Hoi An's economy shrank until there was no longer enough money in the town to tear anything down and replace it. Houses that would have been demolished for modern shop fronts anywhere else stayed exactly as they were, not out of preservation policy, but out of simple poverty. By the time UNESCO recognized the old town as a World Heritage Site in 1999, its greatest asset had become the very stagnation that once looked like failure. streets untouched since the 1800s, merchant houses with their original beams still holding original roofs, a town that fossilized instead of falling. Restoration crews arriving decades later found ledgers still sitting in drawers, family altars still in place, door frames worn smooth by hands that had died a century earlier. The port collapsed. The town it built never did. A river that floods the same houses every year and gets forgiven every year. A festival that switches the lights off on purpose, once a month, so people remember what the dark used to look like. A port that failed slowly enough to accidentally save the town built on top of it. 4 seasons, repeating on a 400-year-old loop. Light, water, work, and water again. Nowhere else does a town choose to keep the floodline painted on its own walls. Hoi An was never saved by staying still. It survived by refusing to stop repairing itself. There's a version of resilience that doesn't look like winning. It looks like a wall that gets repainted every year because the flood always comes back, and the town paints it anyway. Maybe there's a wall like that in your own life. Something you keep repairing instead of walking away from. If this one stuck with you, subscribe. The next town has its own floodline.